Hi, I'm eMpTyG,
And I'm kidding.
and today we're checking out more gameplay from back in January, shortly after Brothers War had launched. It's just taken us a while to get around to editing this one because we had mixed up our format with how we've been, recording the Good Clean Commander games. So we finally got around to this one. And we were happy to show you all the shenanigans that went down.
Yes, this one was almost lost to the archives, but we're here all ready to go. And on today's episode, we have two guests you have seen before. Chris, aka Spell Table Splits, has been on a couple episodes. And then we have Laura as well, who you have seen on one of our more recent face cam videos. But this was technically her first game joining us. So
Mhm.
it's a bit of a new first time, yet not first time game, but it was a lot of fun to have them both.
Yeah, it was a great time as always with both of them. So
Yeah.
let's jump into the gameplay and
Have a
good clean game. We remembered
good
again.
game.
Laura is playing Mishra Eminent 1. This artifact deck wants to use Mishra's ability to turn her artifacts into war-form creatures and utilize the value for making copies of powerful artifacts. And in her starting hand, she has Lithoform Engine, Drastforge Bridge, Nihil Spellbomb, Darksteel Citadel, Mana Vault Key, Command Tower, and No Mercy. Chris is playing Alta Palani Nest Tender. This deck wants to use Alta's ability to make egg tokens, then sack those egg tokens and cheat out scary creatures onto the battlefield. And in his starting hand, Chris has Branchloft Pathway, a Mountain, Arcane Signet, Robe of Stars, Dragon's Horde, High Market, and Swiftfoot Boots. Ken is playing Mishra Claimed by Gix. This deck is focused on draining the board using Mishra's ability by making a lot of bodies and attacking each combat. And in his starting hand, Ken has Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, Blood Crypt, Goblin Rabblemaster, Wayfarer's Bauble, Baylor, Elturel Survivors, however you say that, and Reanimate. I am playing Ashnod Flesh Mechanist. This deck is my historic brawl list, but with the alchemy cards swapped out with some commander staples. It wants to sacrifice creatures early game to ramp with power stones and drop big artifact threats like Portal to Phyrexia. And in my starting hand, I have Feed the Swarm, Command Tower, Transmogrant's Crown, Field of the Dead, Portal to Phyrexia, Homeward Path, and a snow-covered swamp. Laura starts off the game by drawing for turn and plays a tap Drastforge Bridge. She then passes to Chris. Chris draws for turn and plays a Branchloft Pathway. And then Chris passes the turn to Ken. Ken draws for turn and shocks in a Blood Crypt, paying 2 life for it to enter untapped. He then follows that up by paying 1 for a Wayfarer's Bauble and passes to me. I draw for turn and play a Command Tower. I then pay 1 and cast my commander Ashnod Flesh Mechanist. With that, I pass the turn to Laura. Laura draws and plays a Darksteel Citadel as land for turn. She then pays 1 for a Nihil Spellbomb, which allows her to tap and sacrifice it to exile target player's graveyard. She then passes the turn to Chris. Chris draws for turn and plays a Mountain. He then pays 2 for an Arcane Signet and passes the turn to Ken. Ken untaps, draws, and plays an Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth as land for turn and passes it to me. I untap, draw, and pay 2 for a Transmogrant's Crown and pass to Laura. Laura untaps, draws, and plays a Command Tower as land for turn. She then pays 1 for a Manifold Key and passes to Chris. Chris untaps, draws, and plays a Plains as land for turn. He then pays 3 for a Dragon's Horde and follows that up by paying 2 for a Robe of Stars. Chris then moves to Instep, where Ken pays 2 to sacrifice Wayfarer's Bauble to fetch up a Mountain. Ken then untaps, draws, and pays 3 for a Goblin Rabblemaster. Rabblemaster makes a 1/1 red goblin creature token with haste at the beginning of combat and makes other goblins Ken control attack each combat if able. Ken then plays Rakdos Carnarium, bouncing a mountain back to hand. Ken then makes a goblin token but doesn't swing with it because we missed that it had haste. He then passes the turn to me. I untap, draw, and play a tapped Field of the Dead. I then pay 1 swamp to equip the crown to Ashnod. Moving to combat, I swing my commander at Chris for 3 damage. Chris, unable to block, takes 3 commander damage, and then I pass the turn to Laura. Laura untaps, draws, and plays a Sivan Reef as land for turn. She then pays 4 for a Lithoform Engine. She then passes the turn to Chris. Chris untaps, draws, and shocks in a Stomping Ground, paying 2 life for it to enter untapped. He then pays 4 to cast his commander, Atla, Palani, Nest Tender. He then pays 1 to equip Alta with Robe of Stars. With that, he passes the turn to Ken. Ken untaps, draws, and plays a mountain. He then pays 4 for Elturial Survivors. Moving to combat, Ken makes 1/1 Goblin Creature token with haste. Ken then sends a 1/1 Goblin at me and the other at Laura. Since neither of us have blockers, Laura and I both take 1 damage. He then passes the turn to me. I untap, draw, and play Swamp as land for turn. I then pay 4 for a Body Launderer. Moving to combat, I swing Ashnod at Laura. Laura declares no blocks and takes 3 commander damage. I then pass the turn to Laura. Laura untaps, draws, and pays 4 for her commander, Mishra, Eminent one. Moving to combat, she makes a Warform token copy of a target artifact. It becomes a 4/4 construct artifact that gains haste and is sacrificed at the beginning of the next end step. She decides to make a copy of Darksteel Citadel and swings it at Ken. Ken declares no blocks and takes the 4 damage. Moving to end step, the Warform token is then sacrificed and she passes the turn. Chris untaps, draws, and pays 2 for Swiftfoot Boots. He then pays 1 to equip Alta with the boots and passes the turn. Ken untaps, draws, and plays a Castle Embereth as land for turn. Moving to combat, Ken makes another Gobbo token and swings all 3 Gobbos at me and the original Elturial Survivors at Chris. When survivors attack, their Myriad ability triggers and they make 2 copies of Elturial Survivors, or this card I cannot pronounce, with 1 going at me and the other at Laura. Chris responds to the Myriad trigger by tapping his commander to make an egg token. I block 1 of the goblins with my Body Launderer and take 6 damage, and Laura declares no blocks, taking 5. Chris blocks with his freshly made egg token and takes 3 because Survivors has Trample. When Chris's egg dies, he reveals cards from the top of his library until he reveals a creature card. Chris can then put that card onto the battlefield and the rest on the bottom of his library in any random order. The first card is a Sun-Scorch Regent, which allows him to gain 1 life and put a +1/+1 counter on it whenever an opponent casts a spell. Moving to end of combat, the Myriad copies are then exiled. Second main phase, Ken pays 5 for a Baylor. On cast, Sun-Scorch triggers, and Chris adds a +1/+1 counter to Sun-Scorch and gains 1 life. He then passes the turn to me. I untap, draw, and play a Homeward Path as land for turn. I follow that up by paying 3 for a Sword of Body in Mind. Best sword. I then pay 2 to equip it to my commander, making them a 5/3. On cast, Sun-Scorch triggers, and Chris adds another +1/+1 counter to Sun-Scorch and then gains another life. Moving to combat, I swing my commander at Ken. Ken declares no blocks and takes the 5 damage. Sword then triggers when dealing combat damage to a player, so Ken mills 10 cards and I make a 2/2 green wolf creature token. With no further actions, I pass the turn to Laura. Laura untaps, draws, and plays a Buried Ruin as land for turn. She then moves to combat, making a Warform copy of Nihil Spellbomb. Swinging Mishra at Ken and the Warform at me, Ken blocks Mishra with the Rabble Master, and it dies. I then block with my 2/2 wolf, which also dies. Second main phase, Laura casts No Mercy for 4 mana, forcing us to destroy any of our creatures that deals combat damage to her. Sun-Scorch triggers, getting a little bit more chunky. Moving end step, Laura pays 1 mana into her token copy of Spellbomb to sacrifice it and draw a card. Laura then passes the turn to Chris. On Laura's end step, Chris removes a counter from Dragon's Hoard to draw a card. Chris untaps, draws, and plays a High Market as land for turn. He then moves to combat and swings Sun-Scorch at me for 7 damage in the air. Having no response or blocks, I take the 7. He then passes the turn to Ken. Ken untaps, draws, and plays a Buried Ruin as land for turn. He then pays 6 for a Liliana Dreadhorde General. Choosing to +1 her ability to make a zombie token, She goes to a total of 7 loyalty counters. On cast Sunscorched triggers, Chris gains another life, and it is now an 8/7 flyer. Moving to combat, Ken swings Elturial Survivors at Laura, triggering its Myriad ability. Chris and I each get a Myriad copy attacking us. Chris responds by making an egg token, and then moving to blocks, I take 5 damage. Laura has no blocks and takes the 6 damage, and on damage, No Mercy triggers, and Ken must destroy the original Elturial Survivors. And Chris blocks with an egg and takes 4 damage. When the egg dies, Chris flips into a Scourge of the Throne. After combat is resolved, Ken passes the turn to me. I untap, draw, and play a Strip Mine as land for turn. I then pay 6 for my own Liliana Dreadhorde General. Moving to combat, I swing my commander and Body Launder at Ken's Liliana. Ken blocks using a zombie and a goblin token. Both blockers die, and Ken draws 2 cards from his Liliana's trigger. Second main phase, I am not nice, and I -4 the Liliana's ability to force each player to sacrifice 2 creatures. Since I only have 2 creatures, I must sacrifice both. This lets me draw 2 cards from my Liliana's trigger and 1 from the Crown's trigger for a total of 3 cards. When Body Launderer dies, I am able to return Ashnod from the graveyard to the battlefield because the death trigger resolves after both creatures have died. Laura, having only Mishra in play, sacrifices Mishra and returns them to the command zone. Chris sacrifices Sunscorch and Scourge of the Throne. Ken sacrifices a Goblin and Baylor. His Liliana triggers again, and he draws another 2 cards. Baylor also has a death trigger, and Ken can choose 1 or more modes with its trigger. So, Ken has Chris take damage equal to the number of cards in his hand. I have to sacrifice a non-token artifact. Laura draws 3 cards, then discards 3 cards at random by having us each select a card. I realize here that I forgot to draw an extra card when Ashnod died thanks to the Crown trigger from earlier, and the table lets me draw. So that is where the 3rd card comes into play here. Continuing on, Laura discards Power Matrix, Spine of Ishsa, and Mist Vault Bridge. I sacrifice my Crown, and Chris takes 5 damage. With all these triggers resolved, I pass the turn to Laura. Laura untaps, draws, and plays an Exotic Orchard as land for turn. She then recasts her commander for 7. Before combat, Chris tells Laura that he will take Ken's Liliana out if Laura takes my Liliana out. Laura agrees to this and moves to combat. Using her commander's ability, Laura makes a copy of Darksteel Citadel that is now a 4/4 Warform artifact and swings it at my Liliana. I decide to block using my commander, who dies. I return Ashnod to the command zone, and then I draw a card thanks to Liliana's ability. Unable to get a punch through to my Liliana, Laura moves to end step and sacrifices her 4/4 Warform artifact. Before moving away from Laura's end step, Chris pays 3 and casts Generous Gift targeting Ken's Liliana. Having no response, Liliana is destroyed, and Ken makes a 3/3 Elefante. Chris then removes a counter from Dragonhorde to draw a card. Chris then moves to his turn. Chris untaps, draws, and plays a Command Beacon as land for turn. Paying 3, Chris casts Valakut Awakening, putting all 4 cards in his hand to the bottom of his library, and then draws 5 new cards. He then passes the turn. Ken untaps, draws, and plays a Command Tower as land for turn. He follows that up by paying 2 for a Talisman of Indulgence. Ken then pays 2 for a Misery's Shadow. Moving to combat, Ken swings his 3/3 Elephant at my Liliana. I have no response or blocks, so Liliana is knocked out. Second main phase, Ken pays 1 to cast Reanimate targeting Baylor. In response, Laura sacrifices her Nihil Spellbound, exiling Ken's graveyard. Ken responds by paying 2 to sacrifice his Buried Ruin and gets Sword of the Animus to his hand. Ken then passes the turn to me. I untap, draw, and play War Room as land for turn. This now triggers my Field of the Dead because I have 7 or more unique different lands with different names, and I make a zombie token. Paying 7, I cast my Mirror Battlesphere. When it ETBs, I make 4 1/1 mirror tokens. With nothing else to do, I pass the turn to Laura. Laura untaps, draws, and then taps her Exotic Orchard and Darksail Citadel to float 2 mana. She then plays an Is It Boiler Works, bouncing the Exotic Orchard to hand. Laura then follows that up by casting Idol of Oblivion. Moving to combat, Laura responds to Mishra's ability by paying 2 mana and activates Lithoform Engine, making 2 copies of Idol of Oblivion. While that is still on the stack, Laura then uses Mana Vault Key to untap Lithoform Engine, and then pays another 2 to tap Lithoform Engine, targeting Mishra's ability again, which allows her to make another copy of Idol of Oblivion. She then taps her original copy of Idol of Oblivion to draw a card. Struggling to decide whether to tap her 3 other Idol of Oblivions to draw 3 more cards or to swing with them, Laura decides she'll make the responsible decision and declares attacks. She sends 2 copies of Idol and Mishra at Chris for a total of 12 damage. In response, Chris pays 2 for Atla's ability to make an egg token. Then he pays 3 for Root-born defenses, allowing him to populate his tokens and makes his creatures indestructible until end of turn. Moving to blocks, Chris blocks one of the 4/4 idols and Mishra with his egg tokens and then takes the 4 damage from the other idol. Second main phase, Laura activates her other Warform copy that she did not attack with to draw a card. Moving end step, all 3 Warform copies of idol are sacrificed. Chris untaps, draws, and plays a Crag Crown Pathway as land for turn. Paying 7, he then casts Balefire Dragon. He then pays 1 and equips Balefire Dragon with Swiftfoot Boots, saying he found his answer to deal with the Misery Shadow. Ken says that if Chris swings at him with Atla, he'll block with the Shadow, and then he can swing at me with the Dragon. Taking Ken up on that offer, Chris attacks me with the Dragon and Ken with Atla. Keeping true to his word, Ken blocks with Misery, and I take 6 damage in the air. Since combat damage was dealt to me, Balefire Dragon triggers, dealing 6 damage to all my creatures. My tokens all die, and my Mirror Battle Sphere barely hangs on. Chris then passes the turn to Ken. Ken untaps, draws, and plays a tapped Field of the Dead, making a zombie token on ETB. He then pays 2 for a Sword of the Animist, and pays another 2 to equip it to his Elefante. Moving to combat, Ken swings his 4/4 elephant at Laura. On attack, the sword triggers, and Ken puts a tapped mountain into play. Moving to damage, Laura takes 4, triggering No Mercy, which then forces Ken to sacrifice his Elefante, which is not Elephant. Post-combat, Ken then pays 2, equipping his zombie token with his sword, and passes the turn. He also realizes at end-step that he forgot to make another 2/2 zombie from the mountain ETBing with the sword's trigger, and makes another token. Moving to my turn, I untap, draw, and play a swamp, triggering my Field of the Dead. Making a zombie token, I then ask Chris if he's swinging at me with his dragon again. Chris says he wasn't planning to, and feeling slightly reassured, I move forward with my turn and pay 2 and sacrifice my zombie token to cast Diabolic Intent to tutor for any old card I want. I then pay 5 and cast Lolth Spider Queen and use their -3 ability to make 2/2/1 spiders with Menache, Reach, and bringing my little Lolthie down to 1 loyalty counter. I then pass the turn to Laura. Laura untaps, draws, and plays an Exotic Orchard as land for turn. Moving to combat, Laura then uses Lithoform again to copy Mishra's ability on the stack to then make 2 copies of Idol of Oblivion. She then swings both idols and Mishra at Chris for 12 damage. Chris blocks Mishra and 1 Warform token with his eggs and then takes 4 damage. When the eggs die, Chris's commander triggers and Chris puts Hellkite Tyrant and Savage Ventmont into play. Laura then taps Idol to draw a card. She then pays 7 to cast Tesserae's Devastation. This allows her to make 3 tapped Power Stones, then she loses 3 life, and all creatures get -1/-1 for each artifact she controls. Laura controls 10 artifacts, so all creatures get -10/-10, and in response, Chris uses High Market to sacrifice his commander and gains 1 life, and then he returns her to the command zone. Laura also returns Mishra to the command zone. Lolth gains 3 loyalty counters when 3 of my creatures die, putting Lolth at 4 loyalty. She then passes to Chris. Chris untaps, draws, and pays 6 for his commander. He then plays a forest as land for turn. Then, paying 1, he equips the boots to Atla and passes the turn. Ken untaps, draws, and plays a Bajuka Bog as land for turn, choosing to exile Laura's graveyard. This triggers Field of the Dead and Ken makes a Zombo. Paying 4, Ken casts Hellrider and follows it up by paying 2 to equip the sword to Hellrider, making it a 4/4. Moving to combat, he swings Hellrider at Lolth, and on attack, Ken's Hellrider and the sword triggers. I take 1 damage, and then Ken puts a basic mountain onto the battlefield tapped, making another Zombo token. I declare no blocks, and Lolth is knocked out. Second main phase, Ken pays 4 to cast Rakdos, Lord of Riots, and passes the turn to me. I untap, draw, and play a swamp as land for turn. This triggers my Field of the Dead, and I make a 2/2 Zombo. Paying 9 mana and tapping out, I then cast Portal to Phyrexia. On ETB, each opponent has to sacrifice 3 creatures, and at the beginning of my upkeep, I can put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under my control. Chris responds by paying 2 to use his commander's ability to make an egg token. Moving to resolve triggers, Chris sacks his commander and the egg token, and Ken sacks 2 zombies and Hellrider. When Chris's egg dies, his commander still sees it, and Chris flips into Terror of the Peaks. Having no other actions, I pass the turn to Laura. Laura untaps, draws, and plays a tapped Temple of Malice, allowing her to scry 1 on ETB. She leaves the card on top, asking the table which is the bigger threat, Terror or my Portal. I promise Laura that I won't reanimate anything in Chris's graveyard, and only my own. Laura takes the deal and pays 4 to cast Whirler Rogue. While that's on the stack, she holds priority and pays 4 into Lithoform ability to make a copy of Whirler Rogue. With 2 Whirler Rogues, Laura makes 4 Thopter tokens. She then activates Idol to draw a card. She then uses Mana Vault Key to untap Idol and draws another card. Moving to discard, she goes down to hand size and pitches Grand Colosseum. She then passes the turn to Chris. Chris untaps, draws, and pays 4 to cast Defense of the Heart. If an opponent controls more than 2 creatures on his upkeep, he'll be able to sack it to tutor for 2 creatures and put them onto the battlefield. We have no response, so it resolves. He then pays 1 to equip Swiftfoot Boots to Terror. He then casts Fires of Yavimaya, giving his creatures haste. Moving to combat, I tell Chris I won't blow up his Defense of the Heart if he doesn't attack me. Taking the deal, Chris holds back Terror and passes the turn. Ken untaps, draws, and plays a Swamp. This allows him to make another Zombo. Equipping the sword to Rakdos, Ken swings at Chris for 7 damage in the air. This triggers the sword, and Ken fetches up a basic mountain, making another Zombo. Chris declares no blocks and takes the 7 damage. Discounted by Rakdos, Ken then pays 2 for Archfiend of Despair. This prevents opponents from gaining life. Additionally, at the beginning of each end step, each opponent loses life equal to the life that they lost that turn. This means Chris loses another 7 life at Ken's end step. Ken then passes the turn to me. I untap, and the portal has a trigger for me to return a creature from my graveyard. Keeping the deal, I return Mirror Battlesphere and create 4 Mirror tokens. I then draw for turn and play a swamp, making me another zombie token. I then pay 2 for Jadar, Ghoul Caller of Nephalia. I then follow that up by paying 1 to cast Shadow Spear and another 2 mana to equip it to my Mirror Battlesphere. I then pay 2 to equip Sword of Body and Mind to my Battlesphere as well. Unable to gain life, I then pass the turn to Laura. On my end step, Laura pays 3 to cast Chaos Warp targeting Archfiend. In response, Ken casts Imp's Mischief and changes the target of Chaos Warp to Defense of the Heart. With no other responses, the Imp Mischief resolves. Chris shuffles Defense of the Heart into his library and then reveals the top card of his library. It's a permanent card, he can put it onto the battlefield. Chris flips into a Root-bound Crag and puts it onto the battlefield. Laura then starts her turn. She untaps, draws, and pays 3 for a Curse Mirror. With Curse Mirror on the stack, Laura activates Lithoform Engine to make a copy of it. She then uses the Mana Vault key to untap Lithoform and makes another copy of Curse Mirror. All mirrors enter the battlefield as a copy of Terror Peaks. With the first terror seeing the second one, Laura sends 5 damage at Archfiend. With the third terror entering, both terrors in play trigger. Laura then sends 5 damage at Archfiend and another 5 at Ken's face. With no other responses, the damage resolves and Archfiend dies. Moving to combat, she swings all 3 terrors at Chris. Chris blocks with his terror of the peaks and goes to 2 life. Laura then passes the turn to Chris, and all the cursed mirrors return to being mana rocks and are no longer terror the peaks. On Laura's end step, Chris activates Dragon's Horde to draw a card by removing a counter and tapping it. Chris then untaps, draws, paying 4, he recasts his commander, Atla, and uses her ability to make an egg token. Using High Market, he sacks the egg and gains 1 life. His commander's ability triggers, and he puts Cloth, Unrivaled Ancient, onto the battlefield. Chris then activates Dragon's Horde to draw a card. Moving to combat, Chris's creatures have haste thanks to Fires of Yavimaya, and swinging Cloth at Ken. Ken takes 4 damage in the air, and Chris makes 4 mana in any combination of colors he'd like. Chris uses 3 of the floating mana to Beast Within No Mercy. And an editor's note here, we all made a mistake because this was a pretty long game, and Cloth's mana can only be used to cast creature spells, so this doesn't change the outcome of the game, but just a red flag here is you can't use Beast Within and the later another spell with Cloth's mana because it's only for creature spells. Okay, moving on. Chris then plays a Rugged Prairie as land for turn, then uses the last of his mana he casts Nature's Lore, putting a basic forest onto the battlefield. He then remembers to put a counter on Dragon's Horde due to Cloth entering the battlefield and passes the turn to Ken. Ken untaps, draws, and pays 4 for his commander, Mishra, claimed by Gix. He then pays 7 for Chancellor of the Forge. When it ETBs, Ken makes a 1/1 red goblin creature token with haste for each creature he controls, and since he controls 5 creatures, he makes 5 tokens. Moving to combat, he swings 2 zombies and 5 goblins along with Rakdos at Laura. On attack, Ken's Mishra triggers, and each opponent loses 8 life. This knocks Chris out of the game, I drop to 5 life, and Laura goes to 10. On attack, Ken's sword triggers and he fetches up a basic snow-covered swamp, and this makes him a 2/2 zombie. Una blocks, Laura blocks both zombies with her 3/3 beast and the copy of her Whirler Rogue. Then, using her Thopters and the original Whirler Rogue, she blocks all the goblins and takes 7 damage from Lord of Riots, going to 3 life. Ken loses all of his tokens, and Laura loses everything but her original copy of Whirler Rogue. Ken then pays 2 for Palani Summoner, and with no further actions, he passes the turn to me. I untap, and after checking with Laura if she's okay, that I can target the Archfiend in Ken's graveyard and that it won't break our previous deal about me only reanimating stuff from my own graveyard, Laura's chill with that. So, Ken having no response to my reanimation target, I select Archfiend to return to the battlefield under my control with Portal to Phyrexia's trigger. I then draw for turn, putting a snow-covered swamp into play. I make another zombie token. Moving to combat, I swing Battlesphere, 2 zombies, and a decayed zombie, all at Ken. On attack, Battlesphere has a pre-combat trigger, and I tap down my 4 mirrors to deal 4 damage to Ken's face, and it also gains +4 to its attack power thanks to its ability, making it now an 11/9. Since Battlesphere had lifelink when I did the 4 damage, with its ability to Ken's face, I gain 4 life. Ken double blocks the mirror with Mishra and the Chancellor, allowing 1 trample damage to get through. He then blocks one of my non-decayed zombie tokens with his and takes 4 damage for the unblocked decayed zombie and the other zombie that got through. Sphere still managed to deal damage to Ken. I mill Ken for 10 and make a wolf token with Sword of Body and Mind's trigger. I also gain 11 life from Battlesphere. Second main phase, I pay 2 into War Room to draw a card and lose 1 life. I then pay 1 to cast Persistent Specimen, and I follow that up by paying another 3 mana for my commander and move to end step. Ken then takes 9 more damage due to Archfiend's ability at end step, and I make another decayed zombie token thanks to Jadar. Laura untaps, draws, and pays 3 to put a Sculpting Steel on the stack. Sculpting Steel can enter as another copy of an artifact on the battlefield. While Sculpting Steel is on the stack, Laura activates Lithoform to make a copy of it, and then uses Mana Vault Key to make another copy of it. All Sculpting Steels come in as a copy of the Cursed Mirror, which then come in as a copy of Archfiend. A little bit of Inception here. Then using Whirler Rogue's ability for Power Stones and Cursed Mirror, Laura makes 2 of her Archfiends unblockable and moves to combat. Laura then swings her unblockable Archfiend at me and one Archfiend at Ken. At combat damage, Ken dies, and I lose my Archfiend because Ken is no longer in the game. Then Laura taps her idol to draw a card just cuz, and then moves to end step where all 3 Archfiend triggers kill me. GG's all, that was wild. Well, that was unexpected because I really thought I was gonna close out that game once I got the Shadow Sphere on the Mirror Battle Sphere, but then yeah, Chris was like, "You need to knock out Laura. You need to kill Laura," and I was like, "I'm not worried about Laura." And then she murdered us all in one turn with like what
I
3
mean,
life.
I mean, it was my Archfiend that did the work, and honestly, that was a personal victory getting to see it do its thing. So I was very happy.
Yeah, technically you're the winner. It was your card.
Technicality.
Yeah. No, that was super fun. And I think we both voted on Lithoform Engine being the MVP card of the game because of how
Definitely.
much incredible value Laura kept getting by like copying Mishra's, triggers and just all the shenanigans going on there. It was,
Right. It was one of those cards that just stick around and lay under the radar just enough that no one really focuses on it, and it helped win her the game.
yeah, because it definitely came down to like, well, we can't let Terry the Peak sit on the battlefield, and rightfully so. They couldn't let
Right.
like 2 Lilianas sit on the field, so there was just like always something that was like slightly more of a threat. Where you're like, I'm not going to use this artifact removal on Lithoform Engine.
Right. I think there's a lot of value to having a card that uh, does its work, but doesn't ring a lot of alarm bells, and there's a lot of
Hmm.
value in that. And I think Lithoform, it was definitely one of those this game.
Yeah, so thank you for hanging out with us to the end. This was a interesting game to try to write a script for. And also, I'm pretty sure I mispronounced like half the card names. Like, was it Ilterial Survivors? See, I still can't say it. Like, I'm gonna have to start banning
I don't
cards I
even know if
can't
I can say it.
pronounce.
No, just comment and tell her how she said it wrong. I
Yeah,
can gauge
because I'll totally care.
it.
But on that note, if you like this video, please like it. It helps us a lot with our reach and our growth. Drop a
Yes.
subaroo as well if you like the shenanigans that went down. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. We hope you have a good one.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.